Hi, everyone. Welcome to the latest edition of Walter's World, the podcast series. My name is Walter Sweat, and I'm the CTO here at Astadia. Astadia focuses on mainframe migration and modernization projects. And today I'm delighted to have with me Cliff Bradley, who's the president and CEO of TechAffinity Consulting. TechAffinity and Astadia work together on a very successful migration project, and I just thought it might be informative for everyone to hear the background on how this project came about and what went into it, so that you could see if there are benefits for you to consider a similar type project. Cliff, welcome very much to Walter's World.
Thank you for having me.
We're delighted to have you here. Cliff, can you give us a little background on what you've done in the industry and how you came to be with TechAffinity Consulting?
Well, I've been in the IT world for 30 years, as most mainframe guys are. I started my career at GTE Data Services, which is actually now Verizon Data Services in Tampa, Florida, and spent about 8 or 10 years with Verizon or GTE after they changed names, and started TechAffinity Consulting in 2000. Our primary focus at that time was mainframe technologies, and one of our biggest clients was Time Inc. Time Inc. owning most of the major publications in the U.S., being Time and Sports Illustrated and People, and they had 58 magazines, and we kind of cut our teeth in the publishing industry with our Time Inc. client, and built a lot of applications over the years for them.
So the project that we worked on together, how did that transition from the Time Inc. to this particular project? What was really involved in it? What does the system do, and what was the history?
Yeah, I'll give you a little bit of the history of the actual application itself. We call it the pre-sort system. So back in the late 90s, Time Inc., like I said, they had 58, magazines. They're the largest publisher in the world. They had magazines all over Europe and Asia. We were hired as consultants in the late 90s to help them build a customized, what we call USPS pre-sort system. And that pre-sort system is responsible, mainly for putting magazines in delivery sequence and creating bundles and pallets, and the logistics planning of getting magazines, from the printers, to the mailbox. Time Inc. was the largest publisher of weekly magazines. They had People magazine, Sports Illustrated, Time for Kids, and Entertainment Weekly. There's really not a lot of other weekly magazines in the industry. There's Business Week and The Week and a couple others, but Time, had the majority share of weekly magazines, and they're totally different than a monthly magazine. A monthly magazine, it doesn't, the delivery time is really not that important. But for a weekly magazine, most of the subscribers want their magazines in their mailbox every Friday afternoon. And when you're trying to deliver, 20 million magazines a week and get them to people's mailbox on Friday afternoons or Saturday at the latest, you need to have a pretty dynamic system that had a lot of transportation planning, and these magazines print throughout the country. They don't print at one place. They print in California, New York, and Wisconsin, and Georgia. So we came in the late 90s and helped them build this pre-sort system that was really focused on the weekly magazines. Now, in 97 or 98, 2017 or 2018, Meredith Corporation at Des Moines, Iowa, who has magazines such as Better Homes and Gardens, they bought Time Inc.
Okay.
They bought Time Inc. and they didn't have a pre-sort system. They don't have mainframe technologies, and they had their own systems that took care of magazines, with the exception of weekly magazines. And then they didn't want to continue to pay for the mainframe that Time Inc. had, because it was on a huge, IBM Z Cloud mainframe, and the monthly cost was, outrageous. I mean,
I can only imagine.
Yeah, it was 50,000 a month or whatever, or actually it was, I think it was around $50 million a year for their processing. So they wanted to keep this pre-sort application, but they didn't want everything else. So that's kind of how it started. They wanted to keep the pre-sort system for the weekly titles, but they didn't want all the other systems that Time Inc. had. So that kind of gives you a background of the system itself and kind of what it does. The other part of it is there actually is another system that didn't run on the mainframe called freight planning, and it was written and ran on on-premise servers in New York. And it's a, it's a power builder application with a site-based database, and it's highly integrated with the pre-sort system in a sense that it does the truck planning, the routes, the bill of lading, and it does all the logistics planning for the magazine. So there's actually two systems that they wanted to keep. One was on the mainframe and one was on-prem servers.
Okay, super, thank you. And I can only imagine the logistical nightmare of trying to keep all of that information current and accurate and timely. So making sure that it stayed that way had to be of paramount importance, I'm sure.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Um, Cliff, can you give me an idea of the size of the application? You know, numbers of programs and tables or rough ideas of lines of code, just so the folks who are listening would have a feel for that size?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. So as I mentioned, it ran on originally, the timing LPARs were around 35, 100 MIP machines. And the first thing we did is we actually took the code off of these, larger LPARs and put it onto a small LPAR by itself. And in doing so, we determined that it really required like 300 MIPS. It had about 425 programs, 160 to 170 DB2 tables, 400,000 lines of code, and about 1,800 JCL members. So that's kind of the size of the system. And what I mean by JCL members, that's 1,800 jobs. So it was a fairly large system, but it was contained within a very, very large, system-wide LPAR that had a lot of other applications. And we extracted it out of that system and put it onto a smaller LPAR. That was our first step. Then our second step would be to move it over to MicroFocus.
That makes sense. And I'm assuming that they probably didn't consider leaving it on the mainframe just because of cost. Would that be right?
That's right. So when we moved it to the smaller LPAR, which is a 300 MIP LPAR that only contained this pre-sort, when you look at cost of licensing of sync sort and Endeavor and a lot of other things, our monthly platform costs were running $85,000 a month. And we ran on that LPAR for 1 year, and 9 months to a year, while we were migrating it. So $85,000 a month was just for the pre-sort system when we excluded all the other, Timeek applications.
But that's still very substantial, without a doubt.
Oh, it's over $1 million a year just for platform costs, not including resources or a lot of other things it takes to support a system.
Wow, wow.
Yeah.
When did the project actually start, Cliff?
So we started the project on December 5th, 2018. We had a hard end date of September of 2019. I mean by that is that if we didn't finish it by September 2019, we were going to have to sign up for another year, on that 300 MIP LPAR at $85,000 a month.
Well, no pressure there, huh?
Yeah, no pressure, and Meredith was like, we're not going to pay another $1 million to keep this system. You got to get it completed and off the mainframe by September 2019 last year.
And did you make it?
We did. We went live August 18th. We had 2 weeks to spare. We ran in parallel, we ran in parallel for the first 2 weeks of August, and then we did not run on the mainframe for the last 2 weeks in August. But we had it there as a plan B in the event that we needed to roll back, but we didn't. Everything went smooth, and we met our deadlines for our client.
That's fantastic. Cliff, you talked about your mainframe background. Had you actually had experience working in migration projects prior to that?
No, not at all. I mean, and neither any of our resources. I had worked in MicroFocus back in the early 90s when I was at GT Data Service, so I did have some exposure to it, but it's changed a lot in the past 20 years or 25 years, so my current experience with it was nil to none. And my resources that worked on the projects, they were traditional mainframe resources that grew up on a mainframe and really, pretty much only did mainframe activities. So we had zero to no experience.
Well, I know some people consider that a leap of faith. I would hope that you felt confident that, enough of the mainframe types of activities, the fact that you're working with batch, that you're working with the same kinds of data files, that it wasn't completely different, and that it gave you some level of confidence for that.
No, I mean, what happened is we did to do our own little research and try to start learning MicroFocus. But as you know, we partnered with Astadia because of that lack of experience. and that confidence level that we really needed to commit to that client that we could get this thing done in 9 months. And we had a couple weeks training with some of this Astadia staff members that taught us how to manipulate files and how to compile programs and how to map a copybook and how to run a job. But what we found is after just some short training periods of a week or two and getting in there, I mean, COBOL is COBOL, JCL is JCL, a database access is database access. And within, a month or 6 weeks, our resources were off and running. And, we did lean on the Astadia folks for, certain types of skill sets and things that we didn't understand and know how to do. But the resources, they transitioned into the Micro Focus environment very well, including myself. I mean, I'm, president of the company, but I helped design this system back in the 90s. So I know a lot about it. I still know how to code. I try not to code that much, but I also went through the training and get an understanding of how to, manipulate Micro Focus and how to run it on that platform. And, I found it very easy to learn and very, very easy to transition with the skills that we had on the mainframe.
Yeah, having started back in the dark ages on the mainframe like I did, I contend that it's a whole lot easier for an experienced mainframe person to pick up how to compile a COBOL program with Visual Studio or Eclipse, more so than it is for someone off the street trying to learn TSO and ISPF with all the manuals that go along with that. I don't miss those days myself.
Yeah, I find it a lot easier to compile and run a program in about 4 seconds in Micro Focus versus 5 or 8 minutes on the mainframe.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
And we use the Eclipse environment, just so,
okay.
Yeah. So the Eclipse, the one is we use, and we find it very intuitive, and be able to compile a program, update it, and find errors are very easy.
Yeah, and even from a DevOps perspective, being able to, if it's important, being able to promote code and do automated testing with different tools that are out there. I just find that to be such a better environment, quicker and more reliable. And I'm glad to hear that sounds like your experience was the same.
Yes, it certainly is.
Now, you mentioned time a second ago about time for compilation. What about performance? How well has the application performed now that it's not running on the mainframe and is running in this new environment?
Yeah, and that's a very good question. And me being, a traditional mainframe guy, for 30 years, I wouldn't say pessimistic, but I wasn't real optimistic that the system would perform as well as it does on a 3000 MIP LPAR. And on the LPAR, it had about 6 terabytes of data, and it is a sort routine. The system is called pre-sort, so it has a lot of sort routines and a lot of big files that you're sorting 4 million records and things. To give you an idea of what it ran on the mainframe, we would start around 6 o'clock in the afternoon because of load balancing, and they had CICS environments that were up during the day, and we couldn't run batch during the day, stuff like that. And they always preferred us to run at night. But for like People Magazine, we'd start at 6 o'clock through the scheduler, through TWS. And our system would generally complete in about 12 hours, So 6 in the morning, our deliverables would due out to the plant by 8. If we ran into a problem or two, we might, miss our deliverable at 8. But in general, it would take 12 hours for a People or a Time, which are the two biggest magazines. When we got onto the Micro Focus environment, the first time we ran it, it ran in 17 hours. And I was like, this is never going to work. But then we found some tools working with Astadia and some of their team members, profiler options and some things that we can use to identify, where's the time being spent in these programs. And I didn't mention is that we were running DB2 on the mainframe. And when we moved it over to Micro Focus, we chose Aurora Postgres as the database. And what we found is that, the access paths and things within Aurora Postgres were different than DB2, and we had to kind of tune the database a little bit. But long story short, once we went through that performance tuning process, we're now running in 5 to 6 hours.
Wow.
Which is, a huge improvement. And we're starting our system at, 3 or 4 in the afternoon now because we don't have load balancing concerns with CICS. We're finishing at 8 o'clock in the evening, maybe 9 o'clock. And we all go to bed knowing that everything's done for the night and we don't have to worry about having an offshore shift, excuse me. So, I do have an organization in Chennai and Bangalore in India. And we had two shifts supporting this application when it was running on the mainframe because it ran so long. It would start at 6 o'clock and we'd support it to about midnight, and then they'd come in the office in India and take over and make sure that deliverables were met by 8. But now we only require one shift because it's running in 5 or 6 hours, and it's done before we go to bed in the evenings, and we know whether or not everything's completed, and it's all good for the next morning. So it's been a huge performance improvement, which we were delighted to see.
Well, I'm hoping with that performance improvement, you saw the applicable and appropriate amount of cost savings as well.
Yeah, so in addition to the performance improvement, what we find now is that our platform cost, which includes the Micro Focus licensing fees and the AWS cost, are running about $8,000 a month. If you compare that to what we originally were doing on that smaller LPAR of 85,000, we're saving $900,000, $924,000 a year for the system platform cost, that is. So it's amazing, 90% savings.
That is truly astounding. 90% savings with even better performance. That's quite a combination.
Quite a combination, and honestly, that cost savings is what saved this application. There are a lot of savings, with the system, with postage costs and things like that. But Meredith was not willing to pay, the amount of money it was costing running on the mainframe to keep it. They would have found other methods. So, and allowing us to, realize these savings on Micro Focus saved this system.
That's exciting, truly exciting. And obviously that success didn't come without challenges. Could you kind of share with the audience some of the things that you ran into that maybe on day one you didn't necessarily expect, but that you were able to find solutions for?
Yeah, so, and technically, we thought everything would just move over and we'd compile everything. And well, that's what we kind of thought initially. And then we started, testing things and running, and then realizing that, oh, there's some things that we didn't think about that we learned. One of them is that we had problems in the database and that performance that I mentioned earlier. And some of it was because in the mainframe in COBOL DB2, when a program ends, it disconnects from the database. It automatically disconnects that thread. But we found in the Postgres environment, it doesn't. So we were building up all these open threads, which was causing performance degradation. So we had to go into all the programs and just do an explicit disconnect from the database when upon program completion. In addition, access paths differ. The way that Postgres accesses the data within the databases, we needed to fine tune some indexes within the databases. And this is a highly partitioned database. So we have a lot of different partitions for each magazine. That way we can run one magazine without affecting the other. And then the other thing that we noticed is that, we selected an ASCII environment versus an EBCDIC. And in Micro Focus, you could select either, but we moved to an ASCII environment. And, we had to be very careful and diligent about, when we're sorting the files based on, both alpha and numeric data. They sort differently in ASCII and EBCDIC, but in general, we overcame those challenges, and, the system is working really well.
That's super. That is super. Talking about the mainframe and the beauty of it, that it just runs all the time and you can depend upon it all the time. Part of that component relates to disaster recovery. What is the difference been from mainframe disaster recovery to running in this new environment for you?
And actually, this is probably one of the biggest delights that we have experienced in this transition. So those that have worked on a mainframe, for 30 years know that a disaster recovery test is a pretty big activity. When these systems were running under the Time Inc. umbrella, so to speak, we'd have a 48-hour window where we would do disaster recovery. We'd have, 15 or 20 system programmers bring up the systems from the backups from the tapes, bring up DB2, load all of DB2. In general, we'd have about 4 to 8 hours at the end of the 48-hour window after they recovered the whole system to try to test our application. And in a 20-year period of supporting this application, we probably 100% successfully tested the application 2 or 3 times in 20 years. Because at the end, we're at the very end of the system and we just run out of time. So we've done 2 DR tests since we moved over to Microfocus, and they took a total of about 3 hours with 2 people. One of the AWS administrators and then one of my resources. We flip over to the backups, we pick up and run, and we run those for for a couple hours, and then we flip back. So the DR testing has been just outstanding.
That's exciting to hear. And just from the confidence level of knowing that you can do that on a more scheduled basis and ensure that you have time to do it, that's got to be a real positive for you.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Cliff, going back to your team, I'm curious, on the mainframe, there are a wealth of tools that are out there and available. Did you find it easy or hard to kind of not necessarily replace, but find solutions for doing things like debugging and using tools like FileAid or Expediter? What has that experience been like for you and your team?
Yeah, I mean, there are equivalent tools in the Microfocus environment, and actually, I think they're better tools. Now that we've used them for over a year now. For performance tuning, you have the profiler option within Microfocus that tells you what percentage of the time is being spent in each paragraph of the program. And that's a really good tool for performance tuning. You can look at it and say that, 90% of the time is spent in this particular paragraph in this program, and you can isolate it to that and figure out where is it in that paragraph. So that's what we use for for performance tuning for the most part. There's also the data file editor, which is just like FileAid, where you can map copybooks and map files and look at the layouts of them. And it's extremely similar to FileAid, but it's more visual, and you can jump around records a lot more. You can change data a lot easier. Then there's also the debugging tool that has similar things as that they have on the debugging tools on the mainframe. And actually, it's a lot easier to use, putting in your stops and your breaks, and you can visually see everything in it. So we didn't find any deficiencies in the Microfocus tool set that we had on the mainframe.
Oh, that's exciting to hear. Can you give us a real brief idea of what it was like going from DB2 to Aurora, Postgres, as you mentioned that earlier?
Yeah, so let's talk about data conversion first. So like I said, we had probably 6 terabytes of data in DB2 on the mainframe. We only needed about 2 terabytes because we didn't bring all the history with us and things like that. We found that as an opportunity to say, all right, let's just get rid of all this old data that's no longer needed. But we had about 2 terabytes to bring over. And there aren't any tools that will jump directly, from DB2 to Postgres. So what we did with the help of Astadia is we set up a DB2 LUW, kind of a hop. So we converted data from DB2 to DB2 LUW, and then there are tools that we converted from DB2 LUW into Postgres. So that's kind of how we handled the data conversion. It went well. Like I said, we had 162 tables, about 2 terabytes that we converted in there, and everything went extremely well in that process. Now, as far as my team, learning how to use Postgres versus DB2, we find that the SQL, statements are exactly the same. So if you want to select star from table or group by or sum by, so anybody that has, any type of database SQL skills can easily, it was easily transferable into Postgres. There were, how do you access it? The tools that you access it. We're using pgadmin to access the Postgres database. So yeah, we had a little bit of, learning curve to learn, how do you write a query? How do you execute a query? How do you load a database, and how do you unload a database? Things like that. But it's much more visual. It's not just a green screen on the mainframe. You've got click and submit and things like that, and it was very easy to learn.
I don't know if you would agree, but the extensibility of the tools that are available, whether it's database access or for debugging, extending Eclipse, those things, I have just found that to make such a drastic difference to what I was used to when I first started my mainframe career. And it sounds like you experienced some of the same.
I would agree. I think that it actually has reduced our development cycle, even though the system is in a maintenance mode. We just recently, in the last 4 weeks, we brought in The Economist, which is a non-Meredith weekly magazine, to pre-sort and do their distribution and their freight planning. and we had some development to do for them. They had, special characteristics and special logic they needed to put in for Latin America that we didn't have. They had some hand delivery copies of The Economist that go to senators and things in Washington, D.C. that needed separate labels and new types of labels not delivered through the post office. And our development cycles, I think, were significantly reduced in this environment. So we still have development activities going on. And I think, our guys are building it quicker, testing it quicker in this environment than they would on the mainframe.
What exciting times. Cliff, it looks like we are at the almost the end of our podcast time. I just wanted to thank you again for coming on with us today. It's such a fascinating success story, and I love every time I get to hear you talk about it.
Thank you.
And if anyone wanted to reach out to you to ask any questions about your experiences or to learn more about what you do at TechAffinity Consulting, how could they best reach you?
Well, one is they can look at our website at TechAffinityConsulting.com. The second option is to send an email to me directly. I'd be love to hear from you at Bradley C, BRADLEYC @TAFconsulting.com. That's Tom Apple Frank Consulting.com. And I'd love to hear from you.
Again, Cliff, thank you so very much for taking the time. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay. And for everyone in the audience, thank you for taking the time to join us again today. If you need to reach out to Astadia, www.astadia.com. Please keep a lookout for our upcoming podcasts. It's always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.